we're glad you're here today. Thank you for joining us here at GPS. And we're just going to dispense with all formalities and go right to the text. So wherever you are, we have been in Revelation chapters 4 and 5. If this is new to you, you don't know what GPS is, we are going through the book of Revelation verse by verse, not quickly. We've been at this a few months, and we're in chapters 4 and 5. We have Dr. Jon Paulien, Dean of the School of Religion in Loma, and a giant in the book of Revelation. I have a whole section of books on my cupboard and shelf with him. Pastor Sara Colon is our youth pastor at my church at Garden Grove in Orange County. We're now turned to Revelation 5. And I read the paper that John has written about it, and we want him to sort of cover that today, if that'll be okay. The opening of the scroll. So if you don't remember the throne room vision, John looks up and sees the throne, and here's one on the throne. And then there's this scroll that is sealed, and no one can open it. And finally, an angel says to John, there it is, the Lion and the Lamb. He can read it. And so we have discussed what's in the scroll. We've discussed all of that. We've discussed the choirs, the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, all of that. Now we want to tackle the question, when does all this happen? When is the scroll opened? And,
yeah, because chapter 5 is clearly a point in time. Mm-hmm. You know, there's something happening here. There's somebody crying out, you know, who can open this scroll? And people are weeping, and suddenly a lamb appears, and so on. So there's a moment in time, and when that moment is I think, an interesting question.
Is the Greek fit that? Greek has a point in time and has continuous action. Does it say this was a moment, or does the Greek help you at all?
It doesn't say it in those terms, but when you look at chapter 4, the Greek is very clear in chapter 4 that this is not a point in time. It uses the language of continuation. You know, whenever the 4 living creatures say, holy, holy, which is all the time.
Day and night, yeah.
The 24 elders fall down, so it's like a repetitive, continual action. So chapter 4 is clearly not a point in time. It's a general description of some sort. Yeah. But chapter 5, you move right away into a scene where there's dialogue happening and things going on. And you're clearly talking about a decisive moment when a new character appears. Jesus wasn't there in chapter 4. Satan wasn't there in chapter 4. But I think we talked about earlier how the holy, holy, holy is a reaction to the accusations of Satan. Now that's in chapter 12 that we find out about that, but you need to kind of reread Revelation. Our good friend Sigve Tonstad always talks about Revelation was written for rereaders. So first time through, chapter 4, no Satan, no Christ. You know, what's going on here? Chapter 12, you realize there's a war in heaven, so there should be Satan, there should be Christ. And but having seen chapter 12, you come back here and you see hints of Satan, and now in chapter 5, the Lamb appears. So the question is, what moment in history is that when the Lamb appears? And what is its significance? Now, probably a lot of people would prefer that we just tell them what it means and move on, right? You know, tell me what it means and move on.
Absolutely.
But I think it's important to recognize that in texts like this, sometimes the answer isn't obvious. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper. And I'm curious, Sarah, in any looking you've done, I know you've taken a class on Revelation when you were at the seminary, and say, what's your impression? What moment in history would you think this, you know, is that at the second coming of Jesus? You know, is that, you know, when this happens, is it something that happens at the cross? Is it something that happened at creation?
Honestly, I don't remember anyone actually specifying what point in history it was. Like, and I've heard people refer to it as specific things, but I think there's a lot of different theories on it. So I haven't researched it personally, so. Tell us, oh wise one.
Well.
I think we should say something that you said before we got on the air. Not only do we want the answer, but this might be a microcosm of how to find the answer.
How to...
The process of how you do this.
How to process the book of Revelation. Yeah. There's a lot of people teaching Revelation. A lot of people with strong opinions about Revelation.
Yeah.
But when you come to a text and it isn't obvious on the surface what it means, what do? How do you go about it?
Yeah.
And perhaps we should read chapter 5 through 8.
Go ahead.
And just, focus that whole question right there. It says, one of the elders said to me, weep no more. Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered.
So at least it's after that.
Now, this has conquered is an aorist tense. That means at some point in the past, he's conquered. All right? This is not that moment. That moment is already behind. But he has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. So the story begins with a challenge. Who can open this scroll? And the Lion of the tribe of Judah shows up, says, I can handle this because I've already won. I've already conquered. Verse 6, and between the throne, the 4 living creatures, and among the elders I saw a lamb standing, as though it had been slain, with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. So what do you think that's all about? There's a lamb standing there as if slain.
Well, he's at least been slain.
That's also past.
So that's past.
Yeah.
Could the victory be Revelation 1, where it says, I was dead, but now I'm alive forever and ever? Is that victory? I have the keys to death and hell. That would be resurrection.
Would seem so. The slain lamb overcomes. That would seem to be a reference to the cross and the resurrection.
So that's where I would start anyway.
Yeah.
At least we know it's after the cross and resurrection.
By the way, just reviewing an important point that we've mentioned in the past, notice in verse 5 that John never sees the lion. It says there, one of the elders said to me, the Lion of the tribe of Judah has conquered. Verse 6, and let's see, verse 6 says, I saw a lamb standing.
Now I got the word see there, John. Do not weep. See the lion.
Yeah, that's the behold word in the King James. So it's just sort of it's a word, behold,
Consider,
I tell you.
or
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah. The angels say
physically
that in Luke, behold, I bring you good tidings of great joy, which shall be to all people, There is born to you a city of David, a Savior. See, there's nothing seen there. The seeing has already happened. But the behold is kind of like, open your mind.
So the NIV is interpreting a little bit by putting see in there.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad translation. It's a word for seeing. But he's not seeing. If you read the original, he is not seeing as such. He's simply, the behold is kind of a throwaway word.
You're not reading it in Greek. That's your problem.
Yeah. I've memorized all that.
Memorize
No, the behold word is a word for seeing, but it's not. It's an intellectual seeing. Okay. So that's an important piece.
So we've agreed that it's after the cross and the resurrection.
Yeah. I mean, he doesn't say, behold the lion, and then John says, oh, and then I saw a lion. No. When he looks, he doesn't see the lion, he sees the lamb. Now, that might have interesting implications for the character of God. Because when we approach God, we think more of the lion than of the lamb. So this is a great irony here, that when you finally get to see the lion, it's a slain lamb. That's, we talk about God's prophetic surprises. That's what the GPS is all about.
Yeah.
One of the greatest surprises here is that the lion-like God that we expect doesn't show. But when God actually appears, it's a slain lamb.
Small segue.
Yeah.
We went to the One Project, and were you there? No.
No.
So Mark Woodis, pastor up at Pacific Union College, who's a Character of God guy, just gave, I thought, a great presentation on the nonviolent nature of the character of God in Revelation. And just said, we usually see this. So he took all the phrases that talk about torment and all those phrases and just made a case that those were metaphor and symbolic. And that God is not the kind of God who's just one more empire that destroys the empire before him. He is the anti. I mean, he's the opposite of all the empires before. And so it would fit the lion and the lamb. The lion is really a lamb, and he made a whole theme out of that, the lamb side of God. It's terrific, terrific message. I'm going to get him to come to our Character of God weekend in October.
Okay.
It was a great presentation.
Awesome.
So we'll have to get a copy of it for you. Okay, go back to this.
Well, I was just going to say one thing. On a practical side, I think this is where a lot of, I know I struggle and a lot of my friends struggle with the concept of, we talk about humanism, like treating people well, as if it's almost a bad thing because we don't know our doctrine well enough. So like I got talked to, so a couple weeks ago, someone came to me and they were trying to exegete something, but like proof texting, right? And I was like, we can sit down and do this as a Bible study if you want. However, I don't think that was the point. The point of Scripture was not to proof text everything and to like say that, you know, at least I know the facts. I don't have any other responsibilities in humanity, like in the human world. And his point was that I was too focused on being out in the community and like
You need to balance the other way.
yeah. And I was like, fair point. I probably am not the smartest person in the world, and I definitely need to study more. I mean, everyone does. But I was like, I don't think that's necessarily the point all the time. I think sometimes we forget to live out what we learn. And so I think a lot of people fixate on this lion, this warrior, this to do this, you know, like doctrine, and they say this is where salvation is. This is where the truth is. But they forget that there's also that balance. And it's like, you know, Jesus points constantly saying, like, here are the people, go be with the people. And he wasn't in the synagogues, and he wasn't in these places that people thought he should be. And so it kept confusing people. And I think as Christians, sometimes we lose the point also, and we're always looking for the lion, the thing that's going to take by force and change everyone's lives and take over. But instead, there's this lamb, and it throws even our grooves off, and we're the ones that are supposed to understand who God is.
So you are the helpful corrective to us to help us balance, and then someone else was the helpful corrective to balance you.
That's probably true. I mean, everyone needs to be balanced a little bit. But it was funny because their point was so like, you're so humanistic that are you even into theological things anymore? And I was like, I get my humanistic
The doing
tendencies
comes
from
out of the theology.
right. Like that's why I like the story of Jesus. Like if I didn't, then I wouldn't really be living this way. But anyways, so it's just an interesting.
I read in that book on justice that we were talking about from Australia. Dwight has a sermon, Dwight Nelson, on orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And the pendulum always swings.
Yep.
And both are true and both are good.
Oh, absolutely. And like, what is the balance? And that's the constant struggle.
Put a sign here in front for each of us. We'll balance it out. Okay, we
Little
segued away,
scale.
John. Back to
Yeah.
you.
Well, I took a quick look at the Greek of Revelation 5:5, and that word you reference is idou, which is actually an interjection. So it's kind of like, wow, Or perhaps a person says, can't you see that this is the truth? See? So that's the way it's not. It's not telling us that we saw the lion. It's simply saying, behold, watch out. Wow, something's about to happen.
Very good, very good.
So just to clarify that, the ESV has behold, just like the King James. The NIV has chosen to use the C word, which now is confusing. It masks what's going on in the text, unfortunately. All right, so coming back to verse 7. And it says, he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who is seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. All right, so the question is, when does this Lamb appear? When does he take the scroll? When does this activity take place? When do these songs get sung? There's a moment here in time. Now, I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist and very familiar with the Old Testament sanctuary images. And I was aware that for Adventists, a crucial element was the Day of Atonement. And the idea was the Day of Atonement expresses the time of judgment. I knew that chapter 5 builds on Daniel 7. So, you know, you have the 10,000 times 10,000 before the throne. You got the one sitting on the throne. Judgment is set, the books are opened, etc.
Very good.
So I saw all of that, and somebody said that's got to be 1844, because for those who aren't Seventh-day Adventists, Adventists believe that some prophecies in the book of Daniel point to the year 1844 as the time when the final judgment began. And so it made sense to me that this must be, you know, the Lamb taking the book, going to open the book now, that's the judgment. And then the four horsemen, everything that follows is going to be end time, you know, this last period of Earth's history. So that made perfect sense to me. And then I was asked to actually study the text and found that everything I thought was there wasn't.
Say again why they asked that. Why, you said they didn't see judgment in the text.
Well, I was on a committee that was attempting to address some of the hard questions of Revelation, and a person came in, actually a couple of people came in to specifically show that chapter 5 is about the final judgment. And when they were done, all of us were kind of convinced that they didn't have a case. So then the question was, if that's not it, what is it? And they turned to me and they said, well, you know, why don't you study out the chapter and tell us what it is? And so that was the beginning of the journey that got me here, because those were significant individuals.
What was the clue? As they made their case, was there a sticking piece of evidence that just didn't fit?
Well, one of these is the assumption that this is a judgment text. And one of the committee members just said, well, I read it in the Greek the other day, and the words for judgment aren't there.
So even though there's a throne and someone sitting on a throne,
allusions to Daniel 7, which is a judgment scene.
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's judgment. There's other
Not
aspects of
necessarily.
throne without having judgment.
Jesus alludes to Daniel 7 all the time in his ministry. He says, the Son of Man, you know, has nowhere to lay his head. That's Daniel 7 he's referring to there. Is that the end time judgment that Jesus skipped a nap? You know, probably not, you see. So you can use language for your own purposes.
So the lack of any reference to judgment was the cue to say, we're going to dig again.
We need to look again. There's something wrong here. In fact, the first time the word judgment appears in the book of Revelation is in the 5th seal, chapter 6. And the 5th seal says, how long, O Lord, will you be not judging?
That's the souls under the altar.
And that's a continuous tense, saying, Lord, judgment hasn't happened. Don't you think it's time?
Yeah.
So 5 seals after chapter 5, judgment hasn't started yet. So these kind of things were like, wow.
Interesting.
I have to tell you, Sarah.
Yes.
Sometimes students can teach the teacher.
I hope so.
So it doesn't hurt to try. But I was reading a student paper about 33 years ago. And the student said the key to chapter 5 is Revelation 3:21. And I looked at it and I said, if that isn't so, I'd never seen it
And you
before.
quote that student now in all your books and everywhere?
I've forgotten his name, unfortunately. And when I met him once and told him that, he didn't remember having come up with that. So it was a handwritten thing, and I turned it back to him, and I don't remember his name.
Yeah, very good.
Whoever you are who doesn't remember that you came up with this, you helped me a lot.
Yeah.
But Revelation 3:21, the one who overcomes, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. Now, what that student said, he says, in chapter 4, you have the Father's throne, but without Jesus on it. In chapter 5, Jesus joins the Father on his throne. In chapter 7, God's people join Jesus on the throne. And so chapter 6 must be all about the process of God's people overcoming between the cross and the second coming. And it just blew me away. So to him who overcomes, present tense, ongoing, you know, that's something that's constantly going. From the time John writes to the end of the world, people are overcoming.
Right.
That hasn't changed. So that's a continuous present tense. I will give, future, the right to sit with me on my throne. So everybody who overcomes in this life is going to have the right to sit with Jesus on his throne.
Overcomes what?
Well, we'll come to that. Chapter 6 is all about that.
Okay, because I was going to say, that's very vague.
Yeah.
Like, if you just overcome something.
Well, overcoming has to do with the gospel. If you want, we'll just break off just quickly because that's a hot question. Revelation 12:11. It says, they overcame him, Satan, by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. So they overcame him through applying the cross and through giving testimony of that fact. And it even has one more thing. They did not love their life even to death. So Sarah, when it says they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, how would you understand that? How does the blood of the Lamb overcome?
Well, here's how I interpret this, and it's a very watered down version, I'm sure. But the concept of Jesus living, so if you take the practice of who Jesus is and apply that to your life, and then it says, and then the word of their testimony, and then you tell story. So like Jesus was a narrative liver, and like that's what I think is so cool about him is he always told story. And like it was a narrative way that people could buy in, and then they had a narrative to share as well, and they would add their story to it. And so I think for me, the way I would interpret this without being like super nerdy on it is like living like Jesus, you know, following what Jesus has done and how he's lived, and then like putting your narrative into that. And so it's like the transformational process of you being part of the story as opposed to it just being something far away.
Bam, you did it.
Yay!
You see,
you helped
because
me.
at its root, you're absolutely right. At its root, the blood of the Lamb, that's the Jesus story. That's what the word gospel means. It's the good news about Jesus.
Right.
So the 4 gospels are 4 versions of the one story of Jesus.
Right.
And then we respond to that by telling that story over and over again until it becomes our story.
Right, and I think the disconnect for a lot of people is that they always focus, this is my like little high horse, is people always focus on the death of Jesus, which I think is a very important part of our theology. However, if we always just focus on the death, we miss the life, and we forget how we fit into that story. And like the practical application of theology is totally missed by so many people. And that's where my struggle constantly comes.
It is a very nice point, except here it is clearly the blood.
Right, but I'm saying, but you can still interpret the blood as referring to Jesus and what he's done in his life.
As the whole weekend act.
Yeah, but there's more to it than just
the day when the blood poured.
Right.
Okay.
Because I think I think Jesus would probably even get frustrated if it was only like he died. You know, and he's like, what?
Too bad.
I did so, you know, there's more to the story than that. And I think that's where...
So it's one big act, death and resurrection.
Right, that's the story of
The act
Jesus.
of Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, let me back Sarah up a little bit here, because if you're in chapter 12 and go to verse 5, it's a clear reference to the birth of Jesus and nothing else. The birth of Jesus, the ascension of Jesus, here the cross, the blood. So you have the story of Jesus being introduced by pieces of it. And no part of chapter 12 is the whole story told.
Right, but I'm assuming when scholars or people of that time read this text, they knew what it referred to.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? This wasn't, they didn't have to spell out, I don't think, everything. It's
Well, in
just,
chapter 1, it's clearly I died and then I'm alive. So he ties the two together there. So I think you're on solid ground. Just making your work.
I'll keep saying the same thing over and over again in different words.
Yeah, well, there are many theories of the atonement, but ultimately, I think what they all have in common, if we can at least get everybody to agree on this one thing, the gospel is what you couldn't do, God did. Whether you call it, sacrifice. I couldn't sacrifice myself. Me sacrificing myself wouldn't earn anything. What I couldn't do, he did. Ransom. What I couldn't do, he did. Revelation. What I couldn't do, he did. Victory. What I couldn't achieve, he achieved. So the essence of the gospel in a multitude of different metaphors is what I couldn't do, God did.
That's a great line.
Yeah. So that's and to put it more in the younger generation term, it's all about the Jesus story. Mm-hmm. Religion generally is about what you ought to do, but Christ's religion is about what God has done.
Right.
It shifts the focus. And so the character of God and the way that God looks on us becomes critical to the Jesus story. And when that story becomes ours, then it's our story. And that's
Absolutely.
where witness testimony comes in.
And that's just how people can connect with it. I mean, you look at a kid, if you told a kid a bunch of facts, they don't see how it connects to them at any point. I'm just thinking about my nieces, you know? But when I tell them a story, and I'm like, who do you want to be in the story?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, well, not that person, you know? And like, it had nothing to do with the facts presented. It had to do with like, oh, now it's something I can relate to and something I can be part of. And so I think that changes how people read Scripture. And I think we forget that Scripture is a narrative, you know, and I think we make it less applicable sometimes by taking just pieces, facts out and saying.
Does that help with the opening of the scroll?
Well, the crucial thing here is, what is it all about? The first plank of evidence in this theory points to that moment being the moment when Jesus arrives in heaven after the cross. He has conquered, and now there's this heavenly scene. Everybody's holding their breath. Is the problem of the universe solved or not? And Jesus says, you bet it is. I'm here, and I can open this scroll, and I'll show you. And so the decisive moment of the New Testament is the moment from the birth of Jesus, the cross, his resurrection, his ascension, his heavenly reign. That's the Jesus story. That's the heart of the entire New Testament. And to read Revelation as if it had nothing to do with the rest of the New Testament is a big mistake. So I think this is critical. This is only the beginning of the evidence that we can look at. But Revelation 3:21 shows us that the overcoming of Christ is prior to the book of Revelation. It's not future. It's prior to the book of Revelation. And the Lamb taking the book is an event that occurs at Jesus' ascension into heaven. Then, chapter 6, the breaking of the seals is what happens after Jesus' ascension to heaven. It's the outflow of his heavenly reign. So here, the 7 seals, one of the toughest parts of Revelation, is an apocalyptic way of describing the basic gospel story.
I don't know if we can go very far with this, but is Psalm 24 in this, when they lift up your heads, O ye gates, and all of that? Is that at least an early version or a partial version of Jesus entering into heaven and a celebration? He is inaugurating his kingdom. Is there any connection to
Ellen
that?
White's book, Desire of Ages, ties the ascension of Jesus to Psalm 24, that's a song that was sung as he enters the gates, heading toward that throne.
So we'll spend more time in the next show, but at least for today, you are giving us a general thesis, is that the opening of the scroll, and receiving it from the Father, is that the inauguration of the kingdom when Christ went back to heaven.
Because Jesus says, I overcame and sat down with my Father. That's the moment of chapter 5.
Do not miss our next show, because we will take that thesis now and back it up and apply it, and hope you'll enjoy. Be with us next week.